Hello and welcome to Wednesday in Parliament, our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, claim and counterclaim at Prime Minister's questions over benefit changes.
It is time that we ended this institutionalised barbarity against often very vulnerable people.
I have to say to him that the Labour Party is drifting away from the views of Labour voters.
Questioning the man who asked questions, Sir John Chilcot is quizzed about his findings into the invasion of Iraq.
It seems to me it's a binary state of affairs, isn't it? Either it was reasonable or it wasn't.
Well, did he
That's a very well understood concept in law.
And the reality of the thin blue line. MPs talk about assaults on police officers.
She was attacked by the men who pushed her from her bike, kicked her and poured acid onto her face before other police officers could arrive.
But first, welfare, and in particular cuts to the benefits system, was the focus for this week's main clash between the party leaders at Prime Minister's question time. But the serious exchanges had to wait for a few minutes of Commons levity and a case of mistaken identity. It was all about a baby. It followed the news that a Labour MP, Conor McGinn, had stepped in when his wife went into Labour, not the political party, and helped to deliver their baby in the couple's living room floor.
Mr Speaker, could I take this opportunity of welcoming Nisa Constance McGinn and hope that the evidently effective crash course in midwifery undertaken by my honourable friend, the member for St Helens North, isn't a sign to the government that we believe in downgrading midwifery training?
Well, first of all, can I congratulate the right honourable gentleman on the birth, I understand, of his granddaughter? And no, I'm sorry, in that case I'm completely Wait for it. In that case, Mr Speaker, can I just say that perhaps one should never trust a former Chief Whip.
Mr Speaker, it's a bit unfair to blame a former Chief Whip for some little bit of confusion. Very ungallant. Can't we just admire the member for St Helens North on his work?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, at least my former Chief Whip has got a job.
Theresa May getting a jibe in there about Jeremy Corbyn's former Chief Whip, Dame Rosie Winterton, who the Labour leader recently sacked from his shadow cabinet. On to more familiar ground, Mr Corbyn began his questioning on benefit cuts by reminding the Prime Minister of her pledge when she entered 10 Downing Street to support just managing families.
However, we now know that these were just empty words, as this government plans to cut work allowances for exactly those families who are just getting by. Isn't it the case that her cuts to universal credit will actually leave millions worse off?
The point about universal credit is making sure that work always pays. As people earn more, as people work more, they earn more. It's right that we don't want to see people just being written off to a life on benefits, that actually we're encouraging people to get into the workplace.
This week, Mr Speaker, Oxford University studies found that there's a direct link between rising levels of benefit sanctions and rising demand for food banks. 1 million people accessed a food bank last year to receive a food parcel. Only 40,000 did so in 2010. I welcome the government's promise to review the work capability assessment for disabled people, but will she further commit to reviewing the whole punitive sanctions regime?
It is absolutely right that in our welfare system, we have a system that makes sure that those people who receive benefits are those who it is right to receive benefits. Well, that's why we have assessments in our welfare system. But it's also important in our welfare system that we ensure that those who are able to get into the workplace are making every effort to get into the workplace.
Could I recommend the Prime Minister supports British cinema and takes herself along to a cinema to see a Palme d'Or winning film, I, Daniel Blake, And while she's doing so, perhaps she could take the Work and Pensions Secretary with her, because he described the film as monstrously unfair and then went on to admit that he'd never seen it. So he's obviously got a very fair sense of judgment on this. But I'll tell the Prime Minister what's monstrously unfair. Ex-servicemen like David Clapson dying without food in his home due to the government's sanctions regime. It is time that we ended this institutionalised barbarity against often very vulnerable people.
I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that, of course, it's important that in our welfare system we ensure that those who need the support that the state is giving them through that benefit system are able to access that. But it is also important in our system that those who are paying for it feel that the system is fair to them as well. That is right. That is why we need to have work capability assessments. It's why we need to have sanctions in our system. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman has a view that there should be no assessments, no sanctions and unlimited welfare. I have to say to him that the Labour Party is drifting away from the views of Labour voters. It's this party that understands working-class people.
Theresa May. As if the world of football hasn't had enough controversies this year, a storm has now blown up over poppies. Football's world governing body, FIFA, has ruled that the players of England and Scotland can't wear poppies on their armbands when the nations meet in a World Cup qualifier at Wembley on Armistice Day, November the 11th. The ruling of FIFA prompted a display of clear prime ministerial anger.
Has the Prime Minister spotted the ludicrous refusal by FIFA, the Footballing Federation, to let our players wear poppies at the forthcoming Scotland-England game? Will he tell the respective associations that in this country we decide when to wear poppies? And they'll be wearing them at Wembley.
I think the stance that's been taken by FIFA is utterly outrageous. Our football players want to recognise and respect those who have given their lives for our safety and security. I think it is absolutely right that they should be able to do so. I think it's for our football associations, but I think a clear message is going from this House. We want our players to be able to wear those poppies, and I have to say to FIFA that before they start telling us what to do, they jolly well ought to sort their own house out.
Then on to the suspension of the gymnast Lewis Smith after he appeared to mock Islam in a video which appeared online.
When people make fun of Christianity in this country, it rightly turns the other cheek. When a young gymnast, Lewis Smith, makes fun of another religion widely practiced in this country, he is hounded on Twitter by the media and suspended by his association. For goodness sake, Mr. Speaker, this man received death threats and we have all looked the other way. So my question to the Prime Minister is this: what is going on in this country? Because I no longer understand the rules.
Well, I understand the level of concern that my honourable friend has raised in relation to this matter. This is a balance that we need to find. We value freedom of expression and freedom of speech in this country. That is absolutely essential in underpinning our democracy. But we also value tolerance to others. We also value tolerance in relation to religions. This is one of the issues that we've looked at in the counter-extremism strategy that the government has produced. I think we need to ensure that, yes, it is right that people can have that freedom of expression, but in doing so, that right has a responsibility too, and that is a responsibility to recognise the importance of tolerance to others.
The SNP's Westminster leader focused on money laundering. He spoke about Scottish Limited Partnerships, or SLPs.
The International Monetary Fund has warned of the risk posed by SLPs in the fight against global money laundering and against organised crime. It is now a matter of public record that SLPs have acted as fronts for websites peddling child abuse images, and that they have been parts of major corruption cases in Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Latvia, Moldova, and include the arms industry. Now, given the seriousness of this issue, the Prime Minister's commitment to deal with criminality, but the lack of progress on SLPs, will she agree to meet with me to discuss a joint way forward.
And I'm pleased to say to the Right Honourable, he keeps saying, will I meet with him? As he knows, I do meet with him on occasions. I'm always happy to meet the Right Honourable gentleman. But if he wants to talk to me about dealing with criminal activity, then I will be able to tell him about the work that has been done over the last 6 years under this government in terms of the National Crime Agency, working with the City on money laundering and enhancing our ability to deal with exactly the sort of criminal activity he's talking about.
13 years ago, US and UK forces invaded Iraq to destroy the regime of Saddam Hussein. But it was only this summer that the definitive inquiry report into the Iraq War was finally published. It ran to an extraordinary 12 volumes and some 2.5 million words. The author of the report, Sir John Chilcot, had remained silent about his report and its contents until now. Sir John told a Commons committee he believed the decision of the then Prime Minister Tony Blair to invade did long-term damage to trust in politics.
Well, what you are saying is, as far as I can tell, that it was not reasonable for Tony Blair to suppose that there was an imminent threat based on the information in front of him.
If you place yourself in the position at the time, in 2002, 2003, there was enough advice coming forward, not perhaps to support a statement that the threat to the United Kingdom and its people and interests was imminent, but nonetheless that a threat might be thought to exist. Now, there was not such a threat.
Was it reasonable for Tony Blair, at that time that he made that statement, to suppose that there was an imminent threat?
Objectively, no. Subjectively, I can't answer for him.
You mean that he might have had a sudden rush of blood to the head, or he may have just made a misjudgment? Isn't that what subjective means in this context?
Subjectively, and it is addressed in the report in this sense, is that he stated it was his certain belief at the time. Now, that's subjective. You ask an objective question, was it reasonable to entertain that belief? To which I say the evidence does not sufficiently support it.
I haven't actually. I've asked a question which is the test, well understood, the test of a reasonable man. Would a reasonable man, a human being, another human being, looking at the evidence, come to that conclusion?
If you're posing that question with regard to a statement of an imminent threat to the United Kingdom,
I am.
Then in that case, I have to say, no, there was not sufficient evidence to sustain that belief objectively at the time.
So he misled or set aside, he misled the House, or he set aside evidence in order to lead the House down the line of thought and belief with his 18th March speech, didn't he?
Again, you force me, Chairman, into trying to draw a distinction between what Mr. Blair as Prime Minister believed at the time and sought to persuade the House and the people of his belief.
Of course, I'm asking you whether it's reasonable that he was doing it.
As things have turned out, we know it was not. As things appeared at the time, the evidence to support it was more qualified than he, in effect, gave expression to.
Well, that's not what you've really been saying all along, is it? It's not a question of whether it was more qualified. This is a test. It's a test of would a reasonable man conclude that this evidence supported going to war?
If I may say so, Chairman, that seems to me an easier question for me to answer, because the answer to that is no.
Sir John Chilcot. You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, how good is our Parliament? The Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, has spoken of her real concerns about security and police arrangements following the UK's decision to leave the European Union. At a House of Lords committee, Ms Saunders said the European arrest warrant, an EU-wide system which replaced separate extradition arrangements between member states, means, as she put it, we can get people back into this country within a matter of days.
One of the very first one was, which was quite notorious, was Osman, who was one of the 21/7 failed bombers. But he went to Rome. We got him back to the UK within 51 days. Whereas if you look at our non-European extraditions, they take significantly longer, sometimes years. So we're talking rather than days, it's months and years. So that would be one of my real concerns. Is actually it's the speed, and also what the European arrest warrant does, which bilaterals don't do, is that they mean that there is no bar to people extraditing their own nationals. So if you look at some of the bilaterals, Poland, for example, doesn't, well, a number of European countries, 22 I think in total, have bars on extraditing their own nationals unless it's under the EAW. And we have certainly seen in the last few years, I think it's up to 150 people coming back that wouldn't have done if it was under the bilateral. So under the EAW, it allows us not only to do it quicker, but allows us to get back nationals, foreign nationals.
Alison Saunders gave another example of the use of the European arrest warrant, part, she said, of a vital package of measures.
We've had a case quite recently where there was a murder of an elderly couple took place. We know that the suspect fled. His car was found at Dover, just by the ferry going across to France. All our intelligence seemed to suggest that he was going to France and possibly on elsewhere. Because we put the EAW out on the SIS2 database, what we actually found out literally days later was he was in Luxembourg. There was no intelligence to tell us he was there. We wouldn't have even thought to look there. But it sort of transpired he was in Luxembourg, and again we were able to extradite him back to this country where he is currently standing trial for the murder of two people who, you know, we might have missed that had we not had the availability of both the EAW and the SIS2 database.
I mean, one of the criticisms of the European arrest warrant, which one often reads in the papers here, is not so much the Poles coming here, but the Brits going elsewhere. And I think I'm right in saying that there are 20 or 30 cases a year of British citizens being extradited. I mean, how many of those, if any, would you think are what one might call unjustified, in the sense that it wouldn't happen if it was the other way around?
We extradite just over 1,000 people a year from the UK out. Of that, less than 5%
yes.
are UK nationals, which probably accords with your figure. Of course, what we have done since 2000 and I think it was 15 or 14 is put in some safeguards because of some of the concerns that you articulated. So now there's a proportionality bar because there was a concern that people were being extradited for low-level offending, which we would not seek to bring people back for that. There is a proportionality bar, and that's exercised by the National Crime Agency.
Alison Saunders. Labour says the government must take much more seriously the issue of assaults on police officers. Whether intervening in late-night drunken revelries or in more general disturbances, police officers can face considerable physical dangers. Latest official figures reveal 23,000 police officers in England and Wales are the victims of attacks each year. But Labour believes the actual figures could be higher. The Commons has been holding a general debate on the issue of police officer safety.
Increasingly and terrifyingly, we have seen acid used as a means of assaulting police officers. Last year in Warwickshire, a PC was patrolling alone on her bicycle when she saw 3 men breaking into a property. When she stopped and identified herself as a police officer, she was attacked by the men who pushed her from her bike, kicked her and poured acid onto her face before other police officers could arrive. An assault on a police officer is an assault on society. It is totally unacceptable that public servants working in their communities, protecting people, helping the vulnerable, will be subject to assaults as they go about their jobs.
The issue of assaults on police is very serious. It needs to be taken seriously, including gathering and collating reliable data consistent across all police forces. Whilst this is in progress, we should address measures that will tackle assaults now. One way of achieving that would be the introduction of body-worn cameras across all police forces in England and Wales, and encouraging our colleagues in the devolved assemblies to look at the same.
We fully support making the best use of new technology wherever possible. Although an operational decision for chief officers, the use of body-worn video can be a powerful tool, and as has been rightly outlined by the Honourable Lady, we won't agree on everything very often, but we'll agree on this. I think it can provide reassurance to both the police and indeed the public about the way that both parties are working and acting. In this vital task of keeping their workforce safe, Chief Constables are held to account by their democratically elected PCCs and supported by the College of Policing, who set the standards that Chief Constables are charged with implementing.
Let's remind ourselves we're talking about 23,000 assaults on police officers. That is over 63 a day, 8,000 of those involving injury, some 21 a day.
North Wales Police say that assaults on officers are a daily occurrence. And the first problem I think we should address is the lack of accurate recording of assaults against police officers. Plaid Cymru PCC for North Wales Police Force, Argon Jones, has secured sufficient budget allocation to ensure he can realise his manifesto pledge to supply every police officer with body-worn video equipment while on duty. Body-worn cameras collect evidence which proves beneficial in securing domestic violence convictions, as well as protecting individual officers from malicious complaints and physical assaults. There is thus a justice result from having these cameras.
The woman who contacted me, who's married to a police officer, described just how the injuries her husband sustained in the course of his work affect the family, to the point where the couple lied to their children about how he sustained his injuries to stop them from worrying. She says, according to my children, he is the clumsiest dad ever, as we have to tell them Dad fell over a bin, Dad walked into a cupboard door in the station, Dad got caught on the police car door. I'm tired of seeing my husband come home injured and having to lie to my children about how he sustained his injuries. I worry every time he is home late, and I'm grateful every time he returns home safely.
I spoke to an officer today of some 28 years' service, and in his views, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the charging standards, if you like, have been watered down. His solution, which I'm sure the government would appreciate, is not more police officers, but simply upping the ante in the courts. All too often, police officers who have been assaulted and other members of the public services, the fire, ambulance and prison officers, find that the police do a fantastic job getting their cases to court, and then the courts simply don't have the power to then follow up and impose a suitable sentence.
One of the things I think that really is a huge compliment to our police is most forces around the world carry firearms for protection. And yet our own police stand firm behind the principle that we police by consent, not at the point of a gun. And certainly when we see some of the issues in the United States, where far too often incidents that would never see the use of lethal force in this country see a firearm drawn, that it's a real compliment to our officers that the vast majority of them every day go out there not armed with a lethal weapon. But that said, it's right that the police forces, particularly places like Devon and Cornwall, are looking at expanded use of tasers and at measures like spit hoods to deal with those who do want to show violence.
The debate featured the maiden speech of Labour's newest MP.
What happened in Batley and Spen was a violent attack on a member of this House. But I'd like to take this moment to thank the police officers themselves, who put their lives on the line every single day.
The debate on police officer safety. Now, how bad is our Parliament? Could we call it a not too bad Parliament? This summer, an academic report was produced entitled The Good Parliament. Drawn up by a Bristol University professor, Sarah Childs, it made a series of recommendations on how the Commons could meet international standards for a truly representative, transparent, accountable and effective Parliament. MPs in Westminster Hall have been debating some of the issues in the report.
A lot of young people are looking at Parliament and thinking, there's nobody there that's like me. Or there's not enough people there that's like me. I can never achieve that. And if young people have got that, if young people are not seeing people like them in Parliament, why would they bother to become engaged? Why would they think, I can become an MP? If we're not living that, if we're not showing that, if we're not destroying those barriers so that they can become members of this Parliament or of other parliaments.
And whilst this report mainly looks at gender issues, I believe you cannot isolate it from other factors that influence representation here. According to the Sutton Trust, 32% of MPs were privately educated compared to 7% of the general population. Of these, the research shows that almost 1 in 10 went to Eton. That's right, nearly 10% of all MPs attended the same school, a school that, of course, only boys can attend.
One of the points I always made to the Conservative Party when we were looking at things like all women shortlist. Fortunately, we didn't go down that route. But one of the points I always made was that replacing Rupert from Kensington and Chelsea with Jemima from Kensington and Chelsea was not doing an awful lot for diversity in the House of Commons. Actually replacing Rupert from Kensington and Chelsea with Jim from Newcastle actually would have done an awful lot more for diversity in the House of Commons than this sort of tokenistic approach to diversity, which only sees things in terms of simplistic diversity, i.e. gender or race.
Philip Davis. And that's it for this programme. Do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.